Hello. Fairy painting. Well, today it's anachronistic, but at the height of its popularity in the Victorian period, it satisfied many of the obsessions and desires of the Victorians, and so it tells us a lot about society at the time. It was an escape from the pressures of everyday life. It was sentimental, that is, it provided cheap, easy pleasure. It was poetic, harked back to a lost world of wonders. There was also a sexual element that avoided censure. And in a world of steam trains and pollution and disease, hard work, early death, it provided a release, an escape that combined Shakespeare with eroticism. In addition, there was a serious scientific element to it because there were a group of people who believed that there had been a race or races of small people that lived across Europe, and it was that race of people that gave rise to the folklore that we find right across Europe, although it was generally believed that these small people had died out thousands of years ago. This was heightened or exaggerated when Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859, because that was thought to provide a sound scientific basis to explain this race of small people. Now, Victorian fairy painting, like Orientalism, gives rise to what we might call the other, that is, another world in which one can engage one's fantasies. It's a strange and exotic place where anything goes. It could be explored through your desires and imagination, and anything was possible. It could satisfy your deepest desires. So let's move on. By the way, enthusiastic admirers of fairy painting included Queen Victoria, Lewis Carroll, of course, Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, and the art critic John Ruskin. So let's get started with this piece by Luis Ferraro, a Spanish artist, called A Fairy Under Starry Skies. He was born in Spain, and in fact started with a career in the Navy, but he gave that up and moved to Paris, where he studied, maybe a slightly odd mixture, but he studied art, chemistry and mechanical engineering. And he decided that chemistry and mechanical engineering were too dangerous, and so he focused on art. Studied in Paris and then moved to London, where he eventually settled in London. He had a lifelong interest in astronomy, as indicated in this painting, and he became a successful artist, although he died at the young age of 45. I've studied this in order to try and work out what constellations are being shown, but I can't. I'm not an expert in astronomy, so if anybody can recognise the constellations behind the fairy shown, then I'd be pleased. Write it in the comments. I'd be pleased to find out. One of the earliest of the artists who represented fairyland is Henry Fuseli, and many of the early artists, as we shall see, took their inspiration from Shakespeare, and this is Titania and Bottom, circa 1790, and it's a painting in the Tate, Britain. Not currently on display, I don't think. So it's from Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's representing one part of the story, Act 4, Scene 1 to be precise, where Titania wakes and asks Bottom to sit down and he calls for Peas Blossom, and says, "Scratch my head, Peas Blossom. Where's Monsieur Cobweb?" And then Monsieur Cobweb says, "Ready?" And Bottom replies, "Monsieur Cobweb, good Monsieur, get you your weapons in your hand and kill me a red-hipped bumblebee on the top of a thistle. And good Monsieur, bring me the honey bag." So that's, I think if you look in his hand, Bottom's hand, you can see a small mannequin, which I assume is Monsieur Cobweb. But if you look at the overall picture here and some of the characters, you can see that Fuseli is showing us the darker side. There are devilish faces, although there are demure ladies, but there's also an old man, bottom right, on a lead and various diabolical activities. And in the centre, there's a nearly naked Titania succumbing to the spell Oberon has cast over her as she prepares to wrap Bottom in her arms. Blake, also representing Oberon, Titania, and Puck with fairies dancing, another aspect of Midsummer Night's Dream. The fairies are Moth, Peas Blossom, Cobweb, and Mustard Seed, and Titania is saying, "Hand in hand, with fairy grace, will we sing and bless this place." This was painted, as you can see, in 1786, and already in the 1780s there was a growing demand for illustration of Shakespeare's work. And Blake, who'd recently set up a print publishing house, may have been trying to break into this market. In fact, it was the following year, 1787, that Blake's much-loved younger brother Robert died, and Blake had a vision in which he discovered what he called illuminated printing, which was a way for him to produce a complete book, including text. And that meant that from this point onwards, he controlled all aspects of the production. He could produce the text as well as the illustrations, the whole book. And then another early artist who represented fairies is Joseph Mallord William Turner, although in fact this is, I believe, the only one of his paintings that represented fairies, and in this case it's Queen Mab's Cave, exhibited in 1846, now in Tate Britain. Now, Queen Mab is a character that appears in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 4. And it's likely that Shakespeare invented the character based on a variety of fairy queen characters that were discussed at the time in the Tudor period. Romeo has fallen in love, this is in Romeo and Juliet, he's just fallen in love with a woman called Rosaline, who he's seen but never spoken to, and his friend Mercutio makes fun of Romeo and blames his lovesickness on Queen Mab in a famous speech that begins, "Oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She is the fairies' midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone." So that's what has inspired Turner, although his painting is not obviously a representation of Queen Mab's, as described in Shakespeare's speech. Queen Mab is a tiny fairy that is thought to visit us at night and bring us, control our dreams and nightmares. In fact, in Shakespeare's time, the word fairy often meant a witch or a hag. The three witches in Macbeth were described as fairies. And the word midwife that I refer to, she is the fairies' midwife, was a reference to any wise or cunning woman, typically one who was thought to provide potions for a variety of purposes. So it's also possible that Turner had read Queen Mab, which is a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, but my reading of the poem, the painting doesn't seem to directly refer to that source either. What we see in the centre is what looks like a flooded cave, high cliffs either side. It's impossible to make out where cliffs end, cave and water begin. Fairies seem to flit around above the water, some swimming in the water, some misty and half-formed. One on the right is being lifted by a swan. Is that a reference to Leda the swan? Some are red tinged, possibly demons. And Turner did include a line of poetry with this painting. Thy orgies, Mab, are manifold. So it's possible that there's a sort of darker reading to this. As I said, it's the only picture he painted of fairies, and it covers various aspects of the romantic idea of what a fairy was. The critics had mixed opinions. Many critics liked it. One described it as a gorgeous daylight dream. But in this case, fairyland is not a clearly imaginary country and where you can make out what's going on. It's more of a shifting, blurred vision. It's on the border between dreaming and reality. It's a metaphor for nowhere, peopled by non-beings. However, not everyone liked it. Turner's champion, the art critic John Ruskin, didn't like this painting at all. He wrote it was a strange example of the way in which the greatest men may at times lose themselves. And he criticised the colouring of the painting. Another reference to Midsummer Night's Dream, this is the reconciliation of Oberon and Titania by Joseph Noel Paton, 1847, now in the National Gallery of Scotland. It was painted as a sequel to his painting of the quarrel between Titania and Oberon. But it was this painting, the reconciliation, that won a prize for the decoration of the newly built Houses of Parliament in London. And it was seen at the time as an allegory of harmoniousness and harmonious government, therefore. It's a mixture of the sentimental and the grotesque. There's various weird things going on. In the centre, at the bottom in the centre, there's a bird seemingly being beaten to death by a creature using a mushroom. What's happened in the story, just to remind you, is that Robin Goodfellow has anointed the eyes of Lysander with a love potion by mistake, and when he awakes he sees Helena and falls in love with her, and she thinks he's making fun of her and leaves. Then the abandoned Hermia wakes from a nightmare and goes in search of her beloved Lysander, and then realising it's all a mistake, Oberon, who we see here in the centre, orders Robin to put them to sleep again, all four of them, and correct the mistake. Titania awakes, this is Act 4, Scene 1, reconciles herself to Oberon while the four lovers sleep, and you can see the four lovers, the large people in this painting, and that is the scene that we see here. It's worth studying in detail because there's so many weird goings on. Now we come to perhaps the best known painter of fairy paintings. And again, I've chosen one which refers to Midsummer Night's Dream, Titania Sleeping, this is, by Richard Dadd. Now, Richard Dadd was an English painter. He showed a very early aptitude for art and entered the Royal Academy of Art School when he was 20 and was awarded a medal for life drawing when he was just 23. And then, together with William Powell Frith, Augustus Egg, Henry O'Neill and some others, he founded an organisation, the equivalent to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but with different aims, called the Clique. And he was considered the leading artist of the group. Then in July 1842, a couple of years after he painted this, and I should say that by that stage, by 1842, he was becoming one of the leading painters of fairy painting, and this was at the height of the enthusiasm for fairy painting. He was selected by the mayor of Newport, who was going to be travelling across Europe to Greece and then eventually Egypt, to accompany him as the official artist to record the trip. A bit too early for taking a photographer. So this painting was painted before he left and was one of many fairy paintings he painted. Here's a detail of the painting. It's Titania with her attendants surrounded by, as you can see, a variety of grotesque creatures. Now, before leaving on this effectively grand tour of the Middle East, Dadd was self-sufficient and described by friends as a leader, noble and gentle, one of nature's aristocrats. And he was, as I said, establishing himself already as a leading fairy artist, and such paintings were much in demand. However, while travelling up the Nile by boat, he reached Egypt with the mayor of Newport, and while travelling up the Nile by boat, he suddenly, one day, underwent a dramatic personality change. They believed at the time that it was sunstroke, but it wasn't. He became delusional, violent even, and believed he was under the influence of the Egyptian god Osiris. And on his return to England, he was diagnosed to be of unsound mind, and he was taken by his father to recuperate in Kent. And by August, he convinced himself his father was the devil in disguise and killed him with a knife and fled to France. On the journey to France, he tried to kill a fellow passenger but was overpowered and arrested, and then because of he was known for he was being searched for murder in England, he was sent back to England where he was committed to Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital, also known as Bedlam, and he spent his rest of his life there, and although later he was moved to the newly created Broadmoor Hospital, and an enlightened doctor encouraged him to continue painting, and he created many masterpieces while in psychiatric hospital, and this perhaps is his most famous, Fairy Fellas Masterstroke. And he was received positive critical recognition for these paintings. This was painted in 1855 while he was in Bethlehem. The painting took some 9 years to complete. It was actually commissioned by George Henry Hayden, who was head steward at the hospital. And Dad used a layering technique to achieve this three-dimensional effect, as though we're looking at a tiny group of people hidden by the grass. By the end of the 9 years, he still considered it unfinished, and he He wrote a long poem called Elimination of a Picture and Its Subject, called The Feller's Masterstroke. And this poem, which I've read through, hoping that it would describe the meaning of this painting. It does describe all the characters in it, and it does show it is well considered. It isn't just a random assemblage of figures, but it eludes any precise meaning. I think I've got a bit of the paint. Let me read you a tiny bit of, it's quite a long poem. Above clodhopper sits, and like the sod, he's brown in colour, also he's well shod. A satyr's head has buckles in his shoes, nurses one foot upon his knee. Amuse with him yourself, his modern fay. So you can see that there's a sort of description of the characters, and they're linked together in various ways, but the poem really is no more explanatory of the meaning than the painting is itself. Switching away from Dad to another very well-known fairy painter at the time, Joseph Noel Paton, and this is The Fairy Raid Carrying Off a Changeling, Midsummer Eve, 1867. Now in the Glasgow museums, and it shows here, maybe I need to interpret what's going on, but it shows that fairy paintings also had a darker side to them. They weren't all semi-naked women. This is about changelings, as the title makes clear, and changelings were thought to be the offspring of a fairy or a troll or an elf or some other legendary creature that's been secretly left in the place of a human child. And sometimes the term is used to refer to the child who was taken. So it was a fear that many Victorians had that their young babies could be swapped for a child that looked exactly the same but wasn't their child, was the offspring of a fairy. And what we see here is the fairy queen on her route, which is lined by fairy ladies, knights, elves, a puck, goblins, a jester with an animal face, and they're all moving towards a clearing which is marked in the distance by those megaliths. There's various small attendants with a more grotesque appearance, and there's sort of scenes of what you might call horror. If you look on the right, there's a knight about to plunge his lance into something that looks like a monster maiden holding a lantern. That light that's shining is from the lantern. And there's black hooded creatures trying to climb out of a pit, and there's various fairies riding demonic devil's mounts. Now the child, the stolen child, you can see near the centre left, has its thumb in its mouth. It's staring out of the picture, and its royal abductress is ignoring the child. And there's 3 human children dancing in the foreground, but the sinister implications of that become clear when you notice that there are thin chains around their ankles. They're captives, and they're being monitored by tiny elves. So it's ostensibly a pretty picture, which is actually of slave owners, if you like, of children, babes that they've stolen. And as I said, the anxiety at the time was that such things actually happened in the primitive world at the edge of society. There still lurked these evil creatures who could abscond with your child. And it was a fear amongst some middle-class families, which was tied in with a fear that their children could be abducted by gypsies or Romanies, that is, other forms of outsider. And the legend of the changeling was spread across the country. There were legends in Cornwall, Ireland, Scotland, right across Europe, Scandinavia, Spain and Africa. This is John Anster Fitzgerald, another well-known Victorian fairy painter, and this is The Fairies' Lake. He was even called Fairy Fitzgerald because fairy painting was the main type of painting he painted. And many are quite dark, as you can see from the evil creatures top centre. He often had images of ghouls and demons, references to drug use, and some of his paintings have been compared with the surreal nightmares of Hieronymus Bosch and Peter Bruegel. We don't know much about him. He's very well known for his pictures of fairyland, and this is an example that was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1866. He painted elves, spirits, devils, and we can see here there's a devil on a bat attempting to spear an innocent water sprite. We do know he was born in London. He was largely self-taught, and he was first shown at the Royal Academy in 1845 when he was 26. He tended to use these brilliant colours, and they tended to be from his imagination rather than illustrating a literary theme. He was reclusive by nature. That's why we know little about him. He didn't write to, have contact with, speak to other artists. And beware, because many 20th century art forgers have created forged or phony Fitzgerald fairy paintings. His paintings, by the way, which explains why he's often faked, have sold for up to £500,000, although most sell between 30,000 and 120,000. Another very well-known artist, John Atkinson Grimshaw, is less well known for his fairy paintings. He is well known for this particular painting, Spirit of the Night. It's quite a well-known painting by Grimshaw, but he's mostly known for his townscapes. He painted night scenes in almost photographic detail of town centres. Well, here he's demonstrating his skill at night scenes, but the town is below this fairy creature, and it looks like it's a port at night, and it looks like the fairy with her magic wand is blessing the port. The halo around the fairy is unusual and provides perhaps a link with Christian angels, although angels are said to have indeterminate sex. And it's to me it's a fairly innocent painting, but I was reading about it and I can't help forgetting a sentence that I read about this painting. Suddenly, strict Victorian fathers became keen to read fairy stories to their young broods. Well, you can make of that what you will. And this brings us on, this is 1862, and remember, I was talking at the beginning mostly about illustrations of fairies from literature, often Shakespeare. And that sort of evolved until the height of fairy painting, which was 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, which is fairies in their own right often. But that became combined with fairy stories. Now, originally, fairy stories were gruesome. They were written for adults, and they were collections of folklore. One of the earliest collections was the French author Charles Perrault. He predated the collection you might have heard of, the Brothers Grimm. It was in the later 18th century. And 18th, 19th century, and they published a book on German folklore in various editions between 1812 and 1857. And this is an illustration by Gustave Doré of the earlier French collection by Charles Perrault. And this is a book that was published in 1862, and it's various stories. And I've chosen the illustration, one of the illustrations from the story of Red Riding Hood. It's only 6 pages long in the book, and that includes 3 large illustrations. Now, in Perrault's version, the wolf meets Little Red Riding Hood in the woods, and she innocently tells him where her grandmother lives and tells him she's on her way to see her grandmother. And the wolf takes a shortcut, gets ahead of Little Red Riding Hood, summarily eats the grandmother, and when Red Riding Hood appears, he asks her to join him in bed. Then there's a famous sequence of what big eyes you've got, what big ears you've got, and so on, which are in the story. And the wolf, asks her to join him in bed, which she does, and that's what's illustrated here, and then eats her, and that's the end of the story. Now, these stories had a moral purpose. It was only later that the Brothers Grimm toned down the stories, and for this story they added a hunter who comes and rescues Little Red Riding Hood, cuts open the wolf with an axe, and to rescue her and her grandmother, who come out of the wolf's stomach unscathed, and then they fill the wolf's body with stones and drop it down a well. But returning to this version, there's the famous lines, "Grandma, what big teeth you have, the better to eat you with." And saying these words, the wicked wolf fell upon poor Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up. But the interesting thing, I think, is that the story, and many of the stories in the book, end with a moral, and I'll read it in full as it explains that the reason it was written for adults is a bit like Aesop fables. The wolf stands for a wicked man or wicked men. So it reads, "Children, girls most of all, so sweet, so pretty, so innocent and nice. Don't listen to everyone you meet. But if you do, don't be surprised when it's you the wolf means to eat. I say wolf, as there are many kinds. Some seem mild-mannered, benign, without wrath, smooth and refined, who follow girls from time to time. These wolves are the most dangerous kind." So you can see from that moral at the end of the story that it's really a warning to young girls to beware of men. Now, the other thing that happened is that by the 1860s, stories started to be written for children, although originally this is the poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. She maintained that it was never written for children. It's not a children's fairy tale, she said, although The Spectator, in its critical review, declared it a true children's poem. So we're at the turning point where poems and stories being written for adults are being made more suitable for children until in the latter part of the 19th century there's a large market for children's stories. Stories written for children, this is a new thing, that were read by adults to the children. But coming back to Goblin Market, and I think a relevant point, Christina Rossetti did charity work for girls who were former prostitutes, and she said it was this that prompted her to write her masterpiece Goblin Market. The poem is difficult to categorise. It's been described as everything from a children's fairy tale to pornography. Let me look at one illustration. This is by a very famous illustrator of children's books, Arthur Rackham, and he also illustrated Goblin Market. And this is a particular point in the poem where Laura tries to help her sister Lizzie, who's been seduced by the goblins, and she's trying to pay them off with a silver coin. Laura offers the coin but then takes it back, and that makes them angry. They attack her, and then, to quote from the poem, tore her gown and soiled her stocking, pulled her hair, stamped on her feet, held her hands and squeezed their fruits against her mouth to make her eat. The poem goes on and she resists, but they try and cram the fruit in her mouth, and then to quote from the poem, she feels juice that syruped all her face and lodged in dimples of her chin and streaked her neck, which quaked like curd. And this is an illustration of that point in the poem. I'll leave you to decide whether it's a children's poem or pornography. A poem that is a children's story is Peter Pan. Again, we're now later, this is 1906, so this is Arthur Rackham illustrating a precursor to Peter Pan's Adventures in Neverland, which is J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. And in this story, Peter Pan learns he can no longer fly and is stranded in Kensington Gardens and uses a thrush's nest as a boat, and then seeks help from a group of fairies who live around the Serpentine. And the people who lived in London would recognise this as immediately as a view up the Serpentine to the bridge halfway up. And in fact, J.M. Barrie said of all the illustrations in the book, he liked this one the best. And it shows the fairies flitting above the water of the Serpentine. So we're on to the early part of the 20th century, when there was an extraordinary event took place. This is a photograph by Elsie Wright, and it's Francis Griffiths, a photograph of Francis Griffiths with fairies. It was first published in 1920 in the Strand magazine. And remember, I said that many in the early part of the 19th century thought that fairies had a scientific basis. Well, that thought continued to evolve after Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. And many argued, they sort of developed these ideas and argued that the fact that there were stories about small people across Europe was a sort of evidence that there used to be a diminutive or pygmy statured indigenous population in Europe that lived during the late Stone Age, especially common in Scotland. Now, some believed that these small people lived on in obscure parts. Some believe they turned into birds during the day. This is known as the Cottingley fairy photographs, and the interesting thing is that they were cited by Conan Doyle, yes, the Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes. He cited these photographs as evidence for the existence of fairies. The two sisters, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, maintained the truth of their photographs until much later. When they were older, they eventually confessed to the fraud. Now, the fraud should have been evident because we now know that if you look at these fairies carefully, they look two-dimensional. What they did is they cut out illustrations from a book and stuck them on card, and then you can see the pieces of wire. Just here, there's a piece of wire holding up the fairy, and in fact historians have identified the book that contains these illustrations of fairies which they cut out. So it's clearly they were having fun. It was a trick which got out of hand, and so I guess as they were young girls, they were afraid to admit, because so many such important people were taken in by it, that they went along with it. And it was only later, when they were older, that they admitted to the fraud. Let's move on, because we've sort of come near the end. Well, we've come to the end of the Victorian period, and it was the height of fairy painting was in the Victorian period. But I wanted to point out a couple of pictures that show that the spirit of the fairy lives on. This is Mark Lancelot Symonds, A Fairy Tale, 1925 to 35. He mostly painted religious pictures, and he mostly represented religious scenes of people in modern dress, contemporary settings, in other words, because he believed the kingdom of God is already present on earth if only we could see it. He was influenced, perhaps you can tell from this painting, he was influenced by Richard Dadd, and to some extent by the other Victorian fairy painter that we've seen, Joseph Noel Paton. This was exhibited in 1935 at the Royal Academy. Shortly after his death, he died in 1935, and was bought by the Newport Art Gallery, which is where it now resides. He always sought a religious life. He failed to become a monk. He considered becoming an unordained minister, but it was his wife who encouraged him to paint. So he continued to paint. His paintings were often controversial, not incidentally because of the naked children, which would be offensive today. But naked children then caused no objection. It was because he set religious scenes in the modern world, which many thought was sacrilegious. And I'm not sure about the meaning of this particular picture. I'm not even sure whether it's a pleasant dream the girl is having, or a nightmare, or if there's some religious significance. There's trumpets here that appear to be awakening her, but she's not waking. She's in a deep sleep. And I can't tell whether these figures are benign, the figures around us of the young children, or have some evil intent. Let's move on to Kiki Smith, Come Away From Her, and it's based on a sketch by Lewis Carroll. I should just explain, Kiki Smith, I don't know whether you've heard of her. She's an internationally renowned American artist, German-born American artist, and she deals with a wide range of issues. So she's not by any means a fairy painter. Her works address issues of sex, birth, regeneration, and feminist issues. And this work is based on a manuscript drawing by Lewis Carroll himself of a book that he called Alice's Adventures Underground. And in fact, I've got the illustration by Lewis Carroll from a page of the book. and it was Alice's Adventures Underground was published later as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the much better known book. And I think that this is a wonderful work on which to end this talk, because it works on many levels. To begin with, it brings classic Victorian story into the modern world. It invokes the inner spirit of the timeless tale of fairies and their psychological meaning. There's a young girl watching as a swarm of dark-winged creatures leave her. Are they ghosts? Are they the dreams and fears of childhood leaving her as she becomes a woman and has to face the real world? I don't know. There's many levels of meaning that you can place on this painting. But that, as I said, brings me to the end of my tale for today. I have avoided straying from fairies into many related areas, such as the representation of nymphs and other mythological creatures. I've avoided also many modern day representations of fairies and other fantasy creatures by artists such as Howard David Johnson. The real height that I wanted to emphasise of Victorian fairy painting was between about 1830 and 1870, although as we've seen, it continued into children's fairy stories and had a minor heyday before the First World War with those photographs that were endorsed by Conan Doyle. But it was the First World War that largely brought a complete end to any serious belief in fairies. But the idea of the fairy can still be used to evoke spiritual or mythic beings, and that continues, as we've seen, to the present day. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye for now.